Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because we know people are joining us from different parts of the world. My name is Pradeep Nayak, and I am at the University of Waterloo. I'm also part of the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership for Building Strong Small-Scale Fisheries. I'm happy to be the host and will be facilitating this talk today. But before we get to the talk, I want to make a few rounds of introductions. I will first introduce the B2B Global Partnership, following which I would introduce briefly the webinar series, and then I would introduce our speaker today, following which we will listen to the talk for today. So just as an introduction, the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership is a transdisciplinary research, knowledge, and action network with over 100 members from Africa, Asia, Canada, and internationally. The goal of the partnership is to support small-scale fisheries in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we focus on vulnerability and viability is not just in an economic sense, but also to represent all aspects of fisher life, the political, the cultural, the social, the environmental, ecological, and all other aspects. Our focus is on co-creation and co-production of knowledge, and knowledge that is essential for facilitating this transition. We are also working on creating repositories of this co-produced knowledge so that it can inform policy and practice and theory. Developing a multifaceted capacity is another engagement that we do, and that capacity development takes place right from the community to the academia and policy and all other layers. We do engage in a lot of synthesis and integration of the knowledge work to inform the governance and policy processes around small-scale fisheries, and that takes us into the domain of knowledge mobilization. The B2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors and conditions contributing to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries and engage collaboratively with small-scale fisher communities and other key civil society, NGO, government, and university partners to enhance SSF, or small-scale fisheries viability. We are conducting transdisciplinary, community-engaged, policy-driven research in 6 countries of Asia that includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, and Thailand, and 6 countries in Africa that includes Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. In doing so, the B2B Global Partnership brings people and organizations together across physical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change impacts on small-scale fisheries. The B2B thematic webinar series, for which we have gathered here today, is an initiative of the B2B Global Partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability themes and topics within the context of small-scale fisheries. The goal is to feature academics, government representatives, practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries, both locally and globally. And we'll hear one of those people talking to us today. B2B thematic webinar series takes place on the last Friday of every month. This is an exception because of certain conflicts and unavailability of the speaker. We have moved it 1 week, so it is taking place in July, but this is actually our June talk. Otherwise, it would have happened on the last week and on last Friday. And it will continue to be so during the year 2025. For example, in July, we'll have it on the 29th of July, which is the last Friday in July. The series is available internationally through live streaming on YouTube. Details regarding the monthly webinar, including speakers, topics and titles, and links to webinar platform is available on our webpage, which is www.b2bglobalpartnership.org. Today's webinar is the sixth in the series of B2B thematic webinars planned for the year 2025 and the 54th since January 2021 when it all started. And it is my privilege today to introduce Dr. Raymond Ailu as our distinguished speaker of today. Dr. Raymond Ailu is a development and political economist with a research focus on the intersection of ocean governance and economic, specifically rural development. Currently, Dr. Ailu is a postdoctoral researcher at the Lebanese Center for Tropical Marine Research in Germany, where his research is focused on the coastal resources and sustainable blue economy. He completed his PhD at the University of Technology in Sydney and earlier completed his graduate studies at the Department of Economics from University of Ghana. Dr. Raymond Ailu's research includes more than a decade of experience in fisheries value chains development and governance, blue economy, coastal livelihoods, and working directly with local communities and grassroots organizations, in addition to meaningful engagement with policymakers. He is also engaged in teaching and supervision of undergraduate and graduate students at the place of his work. Dr. Ailu has previously worked with World Fish under the Fish Trade Program, which was a Pan-African cross-border fish trade project. Prior to that, he has worked with fish trade as a fish trade consultant for the Sub-Regional Fisheries Agency, and including a number of African countries. He's also a research partner with FAO and also a member of the Too Big to Ignore TBTI, which is a partner of B2B as well. He has a strong list of publications, and you can find that online, and the range of topics covered, but mostly focusing on small-scale fisheries, topics ranging from COVID-19 impacts to blue growth, blue economy, to gender and trade, and many other aspects and topics and themes that impact small-scale fisheries in numerous ways. I would encourage you to look at his list of publications, which is really a great source of understanding and working on small-scale fisheries. So it is my honor today to invite Dr. Raymond Ailu to deliver today's talk for the B2B thematic webinar series June 2025. And the topic of his talk, the title is Trade in Small Fish in Western Africa, Artisanal Fish4Food System Entangled in Fishmeal. Over to you, Dr. Ailu, and thank you very much for making the time and speaking to our people today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Pradeep, for the invitation. It's a great privilege to be invited to this platform. I have, I think, attended one or two over the last 5 years or so, but I think for those that I attended, I learned a lot, and I feel so impressed about the work that you are doing with the V2V, working across the globe to try and highlight the importance of small-scale fisheries and see how they can thrive in the current circumstance of our globe. My name is Dr. Raymond Ailu. As Prativ has already introduced me, I don't need to do anything further than to go straight to my talk. I would now share my screen now. Is it showing now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I think I can proceed right from here. All right. So my talk today is basically on trade in small fish in Western Africa, artisanal fish for food, value chains, entangled in Fishmeal. And as I've already introduced myself, I am based here in Germany at the Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Research. Now, just to give you a bit of background, the Canary Current is one of the world's richest fishing grounds. Of course, due to the nutrient-rich upwelling system that exists in that region. So from Guinea, Gambia, Senegal, Mauritania, and Morocco all form part of these Canary Current system that I described. And small fish production, for example, in Mauritania, as we know, exceeds its local consumption by at least 1 million metric tons annually. And there's potential to explore even more, up to 1.2 million tons of additional small pelagics in that particular country. And of course, for the purposes of regional food security, trade is mostly one of the most important routes of redistributing fish or any other food system across for human consumption. And in the case of fisheries, Mauritania has less food consumption in terms of fish because it has a population of only 5 million people, but with enormous production of small pelagics. And so fish can therefore be redistributed to many, many other parts of the region where it is important for direct food consumption. The difficulty that we face now in that particular country and in most countries in the Canary Current is that majority of this fish is being channeled to the production of fish meal and fish oil. And this fish meal and fish oil is mostly exported to countries in China, in Europe, and some other parts of Asia for aquaculture production. And that in its own wouldn't be a big problem if this food was to be back in Africa to serve the good people of the particular region. In this case, it is not so. This fish that is cultured in those continents end up used to feed very rich population in those parts of the world. Whilst the region in Africa and the countries in Africa are still struggling to meet their food in terms of fish needs and yearly import huge amount of fish to supplement the gap that exists in these countries. So it is very important that Mauritania and Senegal and those countries that are found within the Canary Current become the basket for fish in the West African sub-region. For example, in Ghana, they have fish shortage. In Togo, they have fish shortage. In Benin, in Nigeria, Cameroon, these are all countries that are currently not able to produce fish to meet their local consumption. Yet, in the northern part of the Western Africa, fish is in particularly abundant and is being transformed for fish meal instead of for direct human consumption. One of the most important things that is also important to highlight is the fact that what we know from the literature is that climate change has also contributed to fish migrating from the southern part of Western Africa to the northern part. And this simply means that food is being taken away through these climate impacts from these countries in the southern of West Africa to the northern part of the Western Africa. And so trade is definitely a key factor of redistributing this fish back to where it is needed for direct human consumption. Now, just to give you a little background of the artisanal fish for food value chains in West Africa. Now, fish is one of the most crucial source of animal protein in this region. And in West Africa in particular, consumption per capita far exceeds most of the developing countries that we know in Southeast Asia, as if you look at the data. And small-scale fisheries contribute significantly to this artisanal food, fish for food total production in terms of the volume and also the value of fish that is produced. And small pelagics dominate the fish for food value chains, representing more than 90% of the total fish that is consumed through these fish for food value chains. Now, the fish for food value chain is not just a food for people, but it also contributes to social, economic, cultural values, and also everyday life and relationships of these people in this region. So it is very, very essential part of the cultural setting of countries in Western Africa. just to contextualize this even more, so that you understand how these contexts work in terms of fish for food value chains. The artisanal fish for food is landed mostly and in large quantities by artisanal fishermen who basically, prior to the emergence of fish meal, fish for direct human consumption. There were no other value chains that exist except that fish was fished by the fishermen and handed over to processors and fishmongers and traders for mostly distribution the fish within the region for food purposes. And of course, the production is rooted in wide collection of regional taste. I mean, in fact, if you go to West Africa and you want to really take a census of the different varieties of processing fish, I'm sure you can count up to 100 because for even in a particular country, there could be different ethnic groups with their different way of processing the fish to meet a specific taste and attribute in that particular tribe. So the different products are wide, they are very extensive, and I mean, and it comes with the way the people want to associate themselves with fish. And what we know is that based on the research that I have done in West Africa, this particular food is very popular with inland consumers, as we know it, who have problems with access and lack purchasing power to buy fresh fish, which in most cases is found within the coast communities. This is not to say that the fish is not consumed in the coastal communities, but majority and most part of the fish always turn out to travel long distance and short distance to domestic supply chains and regional trade networks within the region. It is important to know that even in some specific cases, specific products are traditionally and locally oriented, that if you move beyond a particular ethnic group, that particular product is not known. And in some cases, the products are in such a way that if you move beyond a particular country, that particular way of processing the fish is not also known. But there are other processing techniques that are wide across the entire continent, the entire sub-region of Western Africa. Now, just to give you the regionalization of artisanal fish for food system. Now, if you look at the map that you are seeing, it looks complex, but it's very basic because fish moves from the coast and spread up north into the Sahelian regions. So if you look at in the part of Senegal and Mauritania, a lot of the fish is moving towards the Sahelian countries and the countries in the southern part of Western Africa. So fish is moving from Senegal and from Mauritania to Ghana, to Cote d'Ivoire, to Togo, to Benin, and then also from the Ghana part, which is in the south, and Abidjan part, which is in the south. Fish is moving up north to Burkina Faso, to Mali, and it goes far away. Sometimes it's difficult to trace all these routes and map them. But this is to show you that it's not just a small trade that exists within the region, but it's a very huge and extensive amount of fish that is moving across different countries and different borders. We have done some work in the past where we try to look at the amount of fish that is moving from Ghana alone to Benin and in Togo. And we realized that we had up to 6,000 tons of fish moving annually. And these are conservative figures because most of the fish is traded informally and through informal routes. So it's difficult to really have very accurate data to depict the picture. But what we did at that time was to try and map out the volumes of fish that is traded informally from Ghana to Togo and to Benin. And it was incredible that such figures exist and in through this informal trade. Now we are currently working on a different project in Senegal and in Mauritania, and it's out of that project that I'm giving my talk today. And we are beginning to see preliminary that a huge amount of fish is moving from Mauritania, from Senegal to Benin and Togo, and also from Mauritania to Ghana and to Togo and Benin. And in terms of Mali, it is predominantly dependent on Senegal and Mauritania for its fish need, as well as that of Burkina Faso. So these are really important value chains that we are talking about. And we really need to be concerned with any destructive systems that would channel this fish as food from the tables of poorer people in this region to very wealthy societies in Europe and in Asia. Now, just to take you through a little theoretical thinking, and here I talk about the fish for food system thinking. Now, the fish for food system thinking basically tries to move beyond the harvest and catch to address social, economic, and environmental factors that shape fish as food through the production, distribution, and consumption. And if you look on your right, I don't know which part is showing, and the figure that depicts this system basically shows the production system, the provisioning system, and the consumption system, and then the governance at the national level that govern the entire system. So it revolves around to determine where fish moves, whether fish moves to local production systems or to fish meal or to freezing systems. This food for fish system thinking and channel would determine that. And it is very basic as I illustrated. But if you should open this particular box, you have two, three different tiers to be able to clearly understand. Because even within the production system, you have governance with systems within the production system on its own. It has its social, its economic, and its environmental constellations. If you look at the provisioning system alone also, it has its own governance, its own economic, social, and political systems that shape how provisioning is done. And of course, the consumption is also the same. But all of them work together to determine the direction to which fishes move at the end. So a fish will move to artisanal processing value chains. This production or food system would determine if the fish would end up moving to the fish meal system. This particular interaction would determine how this system is done. And so for the fish for food system thinking, value chains or commodity chains perspective always constitute one of the important first steps of understanding this and of moving away from the focus on harvest of fish to a food system thinking approach. And of course, it mostly emphasizes on the multi-directional flow of products, finance, information between different actors. And for example, you can take, for example, connecting different sides of production and consumption, as well as looking at the extra transactional actors that shape the flow of the material resources within the fish value chains. And most importantly, for us in the fish for food system thinking, the normative goal is food security, social welfare, and sustainability, including considerations for social equity and justice. Because, I mean, if you look at the food for fish for food system and you move away from this normative thinking, then you lose the importance of fish for human consumption and think of many other value chains that exist. But for me and for the thinking in this project, our goal is to emphasize the food security aspect of small fish, the social welfare aspect of small fish, and the sustainability aspects of small fish, including the social equity dimensions and justice that exist within this thinking. And so this is basically to give you a broader theoretical perspective of what we mean when I call fish for food system thinking. Now, just to move a little bit back so that you understand the fish meal system. And I call it fish meal, a broken food system. It's a broken food system because what we know now is that globally, about 70% of landed fish, which is anchovies, sardines, herrings, and mackerel, which are very delicious food for many people across the globe, ends up in fish meal or fish oil production. This represents about 20% of the world total wild marine catch that we have. And that is not a small number. And if you look at even the ratio of the conversion ratio, it gets more scary because you're looking at about 4 to 5 tons of raw fish being converted to get 1 ton of fish meal. Just think about that and do the conversion back and see what that means. That you are taking 4 to 5 tons of raw fish to be able to produce just 1 ton of fish meal. Now, if you do the extrapolation, what we know is that the fish that is converted annually in West Africa to fish meal can be able to feed about 40 million people in the region. Now, just to paint a picture for you, this represents a combination of the population of Gambia, Mauritania, and Senegal all combined. For example, in Mauritania and in Senegal and in Gambia, the production of fish meal has grown in more than 10 times or tenfold from 13,000 metric tons in 2010 to about 170,000 metric tons by 2019. And by now, it is even more than what we know because most of the activities and the data is not accurate. As you know, most of the challenges of these countries and the nature in which these fish meal industry operate, they do not disclose a lot of the information and the data because of obvious reasons, because they want to hide the things they are doing from the public. Now, I want to make a very important point here that I am not against the production of fish meal, but what we are saying is that the conversion of whole fish, which is suitable for human consumption, for fish meat production is a problem that we must be concerned. There are many other parts of the fish that can be used to produce fish meal, which include the waste, which include the bones, the heads, and that are not suitable for human consumption. So my argument is not that we should close down the fish meal industry, but what we are arguing is that we cannot continue to channel raw fish, which is suitable for human consumption, to producing fish meal to feed aquaculture farms outside the continent that end up feeding rich populations. Now, just to give you a global picture of the spread and the enormity of the fish meal industry, if you look at the map that you see across the globe is fish meal production. Now, it might not be a big problem in some jurisdiction because they do not eat much of the fish, or they have many other alternatives to meet their protein needs, or they have many other substitutes. But for continents such as West Africa, Eastern Asia, this fish is much important in the livelihoods of the people. And therefore, we have to find a way to curb or streamline the production of fish meal. And I took this map from Share et al. Publication, which was published just this year. And they tried to map out the different jurisdictions that fish meal is spread. And I was so scared that if we allow this monster to grow across the entire African continent, then we have difficulties in our hands. For example, in Mauritania, the number of about 20% of the total population is malnourished. Yet this country produces enormous amount of fish meal that ends up supplying the global market. Now, if you zoom in of this map, this is what you see. This is a spread of fish meal companies across the Western Africa, in the Gambia, in Senegal, and in Mauritania. So in Mauritania, you have Nouadhibou, which has become the biggest enclave of fish meal companies you can ever see anywhere. You have about 40 or so companies all in one particular location. Now, if I say this, it looks so simple, but just picture your mind and consider a train station, the size of a train station, and multiply that by 40 and look at the land size and the enormity of production that will go on every year. If you come to Nouadhibou, you have about 20 companies Nouakchott, you have about 20 companies situated there. Down there, you come to Saint Louis, you have another bunch, sizable amount of companies there. And in Kaya, in Dakar, it goes all the way down to Sanyang and Gonju and Katong in Gambia. So this is a big problem. And that is why we are basically researching on our project to see how can we really divert much of the fish from the fish meal to the direct human consumption using the artisanal fish for food value chains that exist in this continent. Now, the fish meal production has always made strong arguments that their production is also part of meeting the global sustainable development goals. And I debunk that by citing three major key goals that the production of fish meal is in complete contradiction to. For example, in goal 2 of the sustainable development goals, it talks about zero hunger, end hunger, achieve food security, improve human nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. Obviously, this cannot be achieved with the enormity of fish meal production that is existing in the West African region. Now, if you look at goal 12, it talks about responsible consumption and production. Ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Of course, the production patterns of the fish meal, as I have described above, shows clearly that this is not a sustainable production pattern at all. And of course, it threatens the sustainability of food consumption, particularly fish in this particular region. And if you come down to the goal 14, which is really where we anchor our research, conserve and sustainable use the ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Of course, the fish meal companies and the production go in direct contradiction to this. And in particularly, goal 14, target 14.4 and 14B. And I read verbatim from 14.4. It says that by 2020, effectively regulate harvesting and end overfishing, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, and destructive fishing practices, and implement science-based management plans to restore fish stocks in the shortest time feasible, at least to levels that can produce maximum sustainable yield as determined by their biological characteristics. If you go to West Africa, most of the small pelagic species have been classified as overexploited. And so this is completely in contravention to this particular goal. And the major cause of this in that region is because of the fish meal production, because basically they rely on these small pelagics for the production. And in goal 14B, it says that provide access for small-scale artisanal fishers to marine resources and markets. And of course, if it mentions small-scale fishers here, it doesn't necessarily mean those who go to fish, but also it talks about the value chain. And so this particularly threatens the value chains that I will be talking about in a few minutes. So really, you cannot make an argument that supersede this argument that the fish meal production and the global aquaculture production basically goes to meet the global sustainable development goals more than what we have described here about the impact it may have in the local communities in West Africa. That is the regional context, and we must understand that that the global sustainable development goals have to be contextualized to make meaning. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to me. Of course, if you come to Europe, you will say, yes, I mean, that works because, of course, their major source of fish for food is aquaculture. And so, of course, they will say that, yes, of course, they are producing salmons in Norway and in Denmark and elsewhere to feed the population of Europe. But if you contextualize the source of the raw material, which is from Western Africa, then there is complete contradiction here in terms of achieving the sustainable development goals. Now, just to take you to what I mean by entanglement and to break that down a little bit. And I group that into production, entanglement, and processing or provisioning entanglement system. And taking the case study of Senegal, what are the production entanglements that we know at the moment? And these are all preliminary information that I'm sharing based on our last field visit. What we know is that the fish meal, fish oil processing industry has completely commodified the local fisheries into exportable products, increasing overexploitation and decline. And it's clear that from the onset, these resources were basically local products. They were basically produced for human direct consumption in the region. But of course, the emergence of the fish meal has commodified these resources into a more exportable product in the form of fish meal, which then therefore means that the level of production or exploitation has increased beyond what the locals could produce in annual basis. And of course, this fish meal company use trawlers. And these are giant machines with a lot of sophisticated technology that can sweep the ocean floor for whatever is there to be able to feed the industries. Of course, in economics, we talk of sunk cost. These companies have put in a lot of money to establish the mills. You're looking about between $20 million to $40 million to set up a fish meal company or more. And of course, they have to make profit. And so whatever means it takes to meet their daily or weekly or monthly production, they would have to do that. The second point is that most of them are foreign finance and they've taken loans from foreign banks. And so of course, you have to finance your loan. And so West Africa becomes an easy target because of weak enforcement systems, corruption at the highest level, and many other contextual issues that makes it prone ground for these companies to get away with many things. One other thing that is important is that because of the emergence of the industry, there's been a mad rush and investment in terms of entry into fishing. Many people have now entered fishing as business and as a form of investment. Hitherto, this was basically an inheritance family tradition of fishing in Senegal, but now it moved beyond family tradition of fishing to more enterprised form where people invest in pirogues or otherwise called canoes to fish and feed the fish meal industry so they can make money. So this is basically what we call grabbing in the literature, because rich people have come in with money investing in 4, 5, 10 pirogues or canoes which are all fishing and selling directly to the fish meal companies and making a lot of money in the expense of the local coastal communities and the regional market that depends on this fish. In St. Louis, for example, the fishermen used to fish in nearby waters in in Mauritania. Rules were less tighter because, of course, Mauritania did not eat much of the small pelagics. But since the emergence of the fish meal, Mauritania has become tough and tougher in terms of their rules and conditions of accessing their waters. What therefore means is that the fish meals companies took advantage of that to come to Senegal and recruit fishermen because of their traditional fishing skills to Mauritania to fish purposely to feed the fish meal companies. And this kind of relationship has turned into a patron-client relationship where the fishermen from Senegal, particularly from St. Louis, are now indebted to the fish meal companies. And they have to continuously fish for the fish meal companies because they are indebted, because they finance the pirogues, they finance their migration from Senegal to Mauritania. And so these fish meal companies have completely locked in the artisanal fishers into this cycle of production to feed the fish meal companies. Of course, the entire fish artisanal fish system has transitioned from the local economic based subsistences that it was and relational based system of food production to a more capitalist system where people are built. I mean, I don't want to go more deep into this capitalist system, but there's basically expropriation of people and of their value, of their skills, of their knowledge, of everything that they used to produce fish for the human value chains into producing fish for the fish meal company. So it's a complete mess. And of course, I decided to call this entanglement because it's more than you can easily solve at a go in reverting back to the old system. And even more in this entanglement is the fact that there's been emergence of new institutional arrangements within the fish value chains. Hitherto there were not huge involvement of intermediaries. Of course, because fishermen will go and bring fish to their wives or to the processor, and the processor will process the fish and sell and pay back the money to the fisherman, and the fisherman go back to fishing. But of course, because of this fish meal system, intermediate role has become another way of hijacking the entire production system to feed the fish meal companies. And so now in Senegal and in Mauritania in particular, you cannot see any canoe fishing without an intermediary in between. And of course, the fish meal companies have the resources, and they have looked around for all the most influential people who existed within the local coastal communities and recruited them as intermediaries to aggregate fish for them in various coastal communities. And this is another entanglement, because they now dictate the direction to which fish is moving, either to the production of fish meal or to the artisanal fish for food value chains. And of course, if you compare a fish meal production supply chain, which is linked to global pricing system in dollar denominated, they can not be compared with the local women in terms of competition for the fish, because the fish meal companies offer better price and that the women or the fish for food value chains cannot compete. And of course, there's now greater emphasis on the price, on volume of production, and operational consistency for fish offtake in that region. And of course, this has altered the traditional social and gender relationships that exist between fishers and women within the value chain. What I mean here is that fishermen have now also transitioned by emphasizing on price instead of considering the social and gender relationship that existed between them and the women. And of course, because of the fish meal emphasis on volume of fish production and the consistency of their operations, the fishermen feel that, of course, at all times they bring fish, they have ready market. And so this, of course, logically makes sense for any rational consumer in terms of the production behavior. If I bring fish anytime and I can have a fish meal ready to pick it and in any amount of volumes, why wouldn't I sign a contract with such group than a woman who at most times exceeds her volumes of need and may not be able to take the fish at all the times that I bring fish? So these processes have completely altered these social and gender relationships that existed within the fishing communities. And of course, with these things in operation, fishermen now sell the fish to the highest bidder for profit maximization and pay less consideration to food needs of the local population. And in one of the cases where we spoke to a group of fishermen, it was completely fascinating for a fisherman to tell me and us that it is better to send the fish to the fish meal, and whatever money you get, you give it to your wife, than to give it to your wife to process and sell. And I think they took this in a very narrow sense, because of course, if you are adding value to the fish and it is marketed at the regional level or even within the local market, it might, if you're able to move beyond the information asymmetries, you can be able to make more money than grinding it into meal. And of course, also you have to consider the economic operations or participation of the women or your wife, as it were, who needs to also be economically capable to support you in your family. So, I mean, the fishermen took things in a very simple narrative without considering the broader importance of the value chain as it existed. And of course, all these leads to economic pressure on fishing, including fishing for juvenile fish, which is not acceptable, and for the sustainability of the resource. I mean, we talk to the women and they tell you that in Senegal in particular, if you had brought fish which is very tiny, you're not going to get even the market within the local population. But of course now they have no option, because the fishermen, whatever they bring, they would have to accept it that way, which means that in the long run, what we are doing is completely undermining the sustainability of this particular food resource. Now, let's move a little bit forward and think of the provisioning system entanglement. The provisioning system entanglement basically tries to look at the women, and the kind of entanglement system that exists as a result of the emergence of the fish meal. And here I am basically talking about St. Louis, Mbu, Joel, and Kaya, where we visited. Now, just to give you a picture, you need about $60,000, or the equivalent of euros, for a pirogue, that's a Persianer, to be able to operate within the fishing season. Now, I mean, if you look at the women production, there is no way they are able to raise this amount to finance a particular canoe for a particular fishing season. Now, what that means is that they have completely lost access to having any kind of contractual arrangement with the fishermen, because the fish meal companies are in a better position to provide this financing for the fishing season. And of course, I always make the argument that you have to be rational, that if you are a fisherman and the fishing season is beginning, you want the surety that within the fishing season, you can engage effectively in production. And so, whoever offers you these operational costs to meet your operations in terms of the high cost of labor, which has risen the cost of buying fuel, and meeting all, repairing your gear or getting new gear for the fishing season, all this is cost. And so, rationally, if you think about it, it makes sense. And this process has completely cut off the women ability to engage in any form of contractual arrangement with the fishermen to provide them with fish for provisioning. Again, the price of the sardinella or the pelagic fish has moved more than 4 times higher than the beginning of 2010, when this industry emerged. Of course, if you were buying 1 ton for, say, 3,000 CFA, now you are doing that times 4, which is basically 12,000 CFA for the same amount of fish. And if you consider the women commitment to their families in terms of meeting the family demands, children demands, they are unable to compete with the fish meal companies and their agents within the coastal communities for fish. Of course, in most cases, or in some cases, and this is very rare, you find that husbands who operate pirogues or canoes, or in other ways, or canoes, if they come up with 10 or 20 boxes of fish from a trip, they hand only 1 box to their wives or to the woman that they work with. And that is completely inadequate for them to produce and sell in terms of the economics of scale. I mean, if you look at the labor you have to spend, the firewood or the fuel you have to spend, and the time you have to spend on the same amount of fish, I mean, economically, it does not meet the theory of economics of scale. And so, I mean, these are all issues that have made the provision of fish complicated now for direct human consumption. In some cases where the women have big orders they have to rely on the freezing factories to buy frozen fish, which is even super expensive for them. Because of course, why will you leave your community and move to the market center to buy frozen fish, which is otherwise from the fishermen that fish in that particular community? And at the same time, you are paying that 2, 3 times more than you would have got it from the fishermen. Now, what this particularly means is that the women are now also indebted in terms of, and some of them, their capital has completely dwindled and went out in the process, and they now have little money in terms of the amount of fish they can purchase to process, and of course they are not meeting the economies of scale to be able to make any meaningful profit. And the last point that struck me was the fact that the women made an argument that instead of the fish meal companies that should be taking the leftover of rotten fish for production to fish meal, they, the women, are now searching in the coastal communities for rotten fish that the fish meal companies do not need. This is a complete reversal of the natural system of production. Instead of the fish meal companies producing fish meal from wasted fish or forage fish or whatever you call it, they are now using the fresh fish and the whole fish for production, whilst the Fish4Food system is relying on waste fish or rotten fish. This does not make sense to me, and I believe most of you. Now, I've already mentioned this point that most of the contractual arrangements in the coastal communities have evolved from social cooperation, which existed, to a more commercialized arrangement. And women have lost direct access to the fishermen and now rely on middlemen paying up to 2,000 CFA extra to buy fish on credit. Some of the middlemen have also taken advantage in a extent that if you now want to buy fish, get a fish on credit, they ask you to pay extra 2,000 CFA in addition. If you can pay, then they give you the fish for you to go and process and bring and pay the money when you sell the fish. Otherwise, you can't get the fish. And if you imagine a local processor paying for every kilo or so more by 2,000 CFA, this particular means that they are unable to make profit and to buy much fish to produce for and sell. This has particularly impacted the food provisioning practices, including credit and finance within the communities, cultural systems, and food safety norms that existed within the Fish4Food value chains in these countries. And what I mean here is that the credit and finance system was basically cyclical. You get the fish from the fishermen, you process it, you sell it, you make profit, you go back and pay what the value of the fish, and then you take the next batch of fish. This has completely been disrupted and it's not functional anymore in this coastal communities in Senegal. Now, there were some cultural and food safety norms that existed and standard that existed within these coastal communities. For example, there were some conventions of processing fish. And these conventions could be you have to process the fish to a particular taste, or the fish has to be a particular nature in terms of texture before it can be used or it can be processed into that particular cultural standard for food consumption. Now, the women are not getting the required amount of fish and the type and nature of fish they need to be able to process into and to meet those local provisioning conventions and attributes within the community. So, for example, if you needed to get a sardine, it must be fresh before it is soaked in salt water and dried. Now, and that was what within the coastal communities is considered to be the convention for providing that particular fish for human consumption. Now the women get the sardines when they are almost rotten, and they still have to use the same process to produce the fish for that particular taste. this particular situation goes against the cultural and traditional conventional attributes of producing fish through that system. So most of the women are basically improvising to meet the taste of the local consumers, other than producing quality fish that require to go through some particular processes. In Kaya, for example, um, um, the women fish processors face financing challenges, and they rely on traders who charge higher markup. So, for example, instead of them buying the fish and processing it and selling to the traders, they now rely on the trader for front payment so they can be able to get fish and then sell to the trader. And of course, in any economic relationship of such, one would make gains out of it because the other party is in a dire situation. And so if I am giving you money to go and buy the fish and process for me to buy, and of course, I would try to take advantage of such a relationship to make more money than you. What this generally means is that women workforce is declining within the fishing communities, and their role within the fishing system in terms of fish for food value chain is not or no more rewarding, and they are being marginalized in their communities. And this is unacceptable. And all these are as a result of the emergence of the fishmeal industry that has completely entangled both the provisioning and the production system in this nature of expropriation. One of the important things that I have to mention is the fact that Senegal in particular has a very strong regional connection in terms of artisanal processed fish for markets in Benin, in Togo, in Guinea, in Mali, in Burkina Faso. All these regional value chains and trade networks are also being threatened and impacted severely in this region. And in this particular picture, you see a woman. This particular woman, for example, was from Togo when we met her in Kaya. If you look at the distance between Togo and the coastal community of Kaya, then you understand that fish is not just produced for local consumption, but it travels miles and miles away. And of course, this woman trade is likely going to get out or to be disrupted if this particular system continues. And she might be out of business very soon if a check is not put on how these fish meal companies are going about things. Again, this was a truck full of fish in Joel in Senegal, and it was heading to Togo and Benin. Now, the arrow shows a gentleman, and just to give you a bit of story behind this gentleman that the arrow red is showing migrated from Togo to Germany as an illegal immigrant through the Mediterranean Sea. Now, he was deported back to Togo. And when he got to Togo, out of embarrassment within his community, he decided to move to Senegal to see how he can survive or make life for himself. Of course, Togo speaks French and Senegal speaks French. So he thought that was a better place to go and start his life. When he was in Senegal, he had nothing. He slept in a nearby stadium on the benches for weeks, if not months. Later, he got to know that some particular people from his country in Togo comes to Senegal to buy fish. So he decided to go there to work as a factory hand or as a laborer, helping them to pack their fish into trucks. He realized that there was a good opportunity there for him. So he traveled back to Togo, sold his car that he had bought, and the amount of money he had saved in his bank account when he was in Germany, and brought that money all together to Senegal, partnered with a friend, and they've worked for the last 3 years. And this was one consignment that they were now moving from Joel to Togo. This tells a story that fish trade in West Africa is not just a mere activity, but it is transforming lives, transforming economies, and transforming communities in terms of food. Now, I know the time is running, but I will still want to talk a little bit about Mauritania.
If you can conclude in a minute or two, because yeah, there are questions, we can
Okay,
leave a few minutes. Sorry to
I would
interrupt.
do that. So in Mauritania, the situation is the same with all these entanglements and happening there. I want to talk about this particular story in Guantanamo. Guantanamo is in Nouadhibou, where you find Ghanaians, you find Nigerians, and you find Malians producing fish and exporting to their countries. It is particularly interesting to know that the Nigerian production is uh, is to serve as not as an alternative to the Norwegian cod that is exported from Norway to Nigeria. And that particular fish that is produced in Mauritania is to serve the poorer population in Nigeria, which are not able to buy the Norwegian cod that is imported from Norway. The Ghanaian trade basically is into shark and other fish that is delicacy in Ghana. So I will quickly move fast. One of the things I want to say is that there is opportunity in Mauritania because already fresh fish is exported from Mauritania to many parts of West Africa. But of course, the artisanal fish for food value chain is another alternative where the country can prioritize to supply fish for the region. We have already seen that the different processing techniques in this particular country mirrors those in Ghana, in Ivory Coast, and in many parts of the continent. And of course, there's already established regional trade patterns and consumer taste that has been developed in the region. To conclude, it is important to note that fishmeal industries is fundamentally altering the traditional fish for food value chains in the region, and that women now compete with fishmeal companies for deteriorated fish rather than assessing quality catch to produce food for direct human consumption. And women processors face systemic exclusion from direct fishers' access and are forced to rely on expensive middlemen. And of course, despite the pressure, sophisticated artisanal trade networks persist across West Africa in terms of Mali, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Togo, and Benin. And very important implications here for food security risks that the diversion of fish to fish meal threatens protein access for food insecure populations in the region, and that traditional livelihoods are being undermined by the capital intensive industrial competition that exists in this region. And it is important that a regulatory framework is put in place to prioritize regional food security over export-oriented fish meal production. Thank you so much. And this was a meal that was served to us by the Amaragan people who live in Bandagar in Mauritania, who solely depend on fish for their livelihood. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Raymond. That was one, really, really interesting, and the depth of the stories that you told us is really eye-opening, in many many ways, because people work on fish, look at certain aspects of fish and how it relates to the communities and the economies. But then one particular sector like the fish meal comes in and then tries to kind of not only entangle the whole web of relationships and value chain connections, but also kind of disturbs the existing modes of and ways of life. So that's really really powerful and interesting. So we don't have a lot of time, and my apologies that I interrupted you in your free flowing talk, because I wanted to leave a few minutes for some questions. So I will jump into the questions. The first question is by Nabia Nair. And Nabia is asking, in what ways have intermediary dealers and market-driven value chains restructured traditional social and gender roles in Senegalese fishing communities? You mentioned some of that in your later case studies, but if you could briefly address that, so that we have a couple of other questions that we can take up.
Yeah, so what these particular intermediaries have done is that they have become the connection between the fishermen the finance and the fish meal companies. So they are in the link, and they particularly receive the financing from the fish meal company. And they come to the coastal community and aggregate the fishermen, say 10 fishermen. And out of the finance that and the contract arrangement they have with the fish meal company, they then finance the fishermen to go fishing. And when the fish come, the fish all is landed to them, and they determine the direction the fish goes. And so, of course, if they've received financing from the fish meat companies, and the contract is for them to supply a certain amount of fish to the fish meat company in a week or in a month, depending on the different arrangement they have. And this has completely reoriented the fishermen direction from the women, which they used to have direct relationship with, which is to fish and come offshore, give the fish to the onshore, give the fish to the woman, and the woman process. And so this is the basic concept that has completely disrupted the arrangement from the women. And so the women now do not have direct contact or direct access to the fishermen, unlike they used to, where they can basically have an arrangements and to get fish from the fishermen directly. So this is in a nutshell what the arrangement. It's more complicated than that, and there are many other aspects, but because of time, this is just one of the key anchors of how the current system operates.
Yeah. The second question is by Sabrina Zaman, and Sabrina is asking, how can governments balance the competing needs of local food security and foreign exchange earnings from fish meal exports?
Thank you so much, Sabrina. I mean, this is very important, and this is a very old story in a new way. Over the years, West Africa has been in this cycle of different contractual arrangement with foreign countries, either be it fishery partnership agreements or access agreement, or fish meal has now become just one dimension of that. And I think it's important that local people put pressure on their government, because food is a right. And if you look at the African Union Charter on food security in the region, it talks about provision of fish for food for local human consumption. If you go to even the UN charters or most of the human rights charters that exist globally, these are all ingrained in it, that people's right to food, right to culture, right to livelihood is important. I think government needs to prioritize this. I don't have an exact answer for you, but I think it's for all of us to think that why would our government do this to us? If we need fish for food, why would they sell it to export in terms of meal, fish meal, whilst we are food hungry in terms of our local requirements? I don't have exact answer, but I think it's for the citizens, it's for all of us and researchers to also highlight the important role of fish to the population. Maybe sometimes our governments really do not quantify I mean, the volume and the value of and the contribution of small scale fish for their country or for their population, and so they overlook it. But if you really go into the fine grained numbers and look at the role that small scale fisheries contribute in terms of food, in terms of human relations, in terms of social, in terms of economic, in terms of local economies, one would have no doubt than to prioritize that particular food chain. Most of the fish meal companies' investment ends up repatriating all their money back to where the investments came from, and the coastal countries really benefit nothing. And they don't look at these things. They just consider the amount of fees and the monies that investors quote that they are going to invest. And of course, if you are a government and somebody comes and say, oh, look, I'm going to invest 40 million in fish meal company in your country, you begin to have watery eyes because you think that's good money. But what you might not consider is that the investor is going to make back all the money. And in the case of fish meal, all the fish is exported. and the foreign currency is going back to their country. They're not bringing it back to West Africa to save in a CFA. They are going to save it in dollar or in euro or in pound, where they can conserve their value. So I don't have an answer for you, Sabrina, but I think this is what I can briefly say.
Yeah, yeah. And then there are so many different arguments. Governments have always adopted a roundabout way to help people, if at all. I mean,
Mm.
they would argue that, the food security would be achieved through enhanced or increased aquaculture production, and aquaculture would feed the world. But at the same time, it's a very roundabout way of, doing aquaculture and feeding the people, because you're diverting food, primary food to aquaculture, and then aquaculture would feed it. It's just insane, in terms of, how the logic, I don't find any logic in that, but, I mean, that's how many governments would, argue, thank you for that answer, and thanks, Sabrina, for the interesting question. So the next one is by Dr. Derek Armitage, and Derek is writing, "Thank you for very interesting talk and overview of small-scale fisheries in West Africa. I found the idea of entanglement very informative. Of course, entanglement exists because certain actors, whether it's the bank or fish meal companies, are benefiting from this entanglement, and they have no incentive to change the situation. So it sounds like a very resilient system. What are some of the possible mechanisms to break or undermine the resilience of this system and flip the fisheries into a more equitable and sustainable system? And here is there a particular scale of intervention or entry point that offers some hope for change?"
Thank you so much, Derek, for this insightful comment. I think, yes, I mean, and that is the key question of our project. I mean, you have just captured our key question so well, even more than we have. And so our key question is, how can we redirect significant amount of this fish to direct human consumption? And I'm sure at the end of our project, we will be able to give some scenarios, um, um, what could be done. But one of the things I would say is to improve the artisanal fish for food value chain. Uh, because if you improve the value chain in terms of innovate the kind of production that they have, and increase the value of the fish, and the value here, I mean the market value of the fish, it might end up being competitive. I don't know how that would work, but I'm thinking that if value is added to the fish, and the fish have a good market price within the local markets and within the regional market, that can increase the profit margins of the fish, of the women, in that they can be competitive in terms of the fish. The second point I would say is that it is important that governments ensure that local fish needs are met before issuing licenses to fish meal companies to even produce fish meal, because you cannot overlook the local food needs and continue to issue licenses for people to establish companies. And I think it has to take the government to do the figures and understand clearly what their local fish needs are, and what is the priority of the region, the regional fish needs. And if we are able to meet this fish meal needs, the extra fish could potentially be considered. But if until that, one would not be able to put a feed on the ground and say, look, this is the amount of fish that we need to feed the people. So it's important that local fish needs to be satisfied before any other considerations. And the last thing is to change the way we consider investment. There are good investment and there are bad investment. Uh, how do you deal with bad investment? You deal with bad investment by putting in conditional economic measures and structural measures that would that would discourage such bad investment. It could be taxes, it could be other forms of interventions that makes it so, unadvisable for establishing fish meal companies. And the last thing I would say is that one has to insist on the rules of natural justice and the laws that exist in that particular country. If the rule is that byproduct of fish, which is the heads of fish, the tails, the bones, and whatever, should be used for fish meat production, one has to ensure that that law works at the local context. I'm sure these are the preliminary things to say that one can do. But going forward, I think it is important that we research more on the artisanal fish for food value chain and understand what interventions we can also do within that particular value chain. And that can make them very competitive. And the last thing is to ensure the collective action of these value chains. Sometimes these collective actions can become a very good ground for a good social innovation that helps they themselves to address their local challenges. So this is the few propositions I can say.
Thank you very much. There are cultures where, fish is eaten from head to tail, nothing is left, and, and
Yeah.
so, yeah, there's more competition in that sense, but, it's good suggestion that, it can, one can look at, what parts go to the fish meal and, what part goes to Fish4Food for people, So we are at time, if I had time, I would have asked you a few other questions, but I want to leave you and the audience with two questions, as food for thought, Um, so very interesting entanglements, kind of, analysis along the four, key elements of the food systems thinking, production, provision, governance, and consumption. There's much to talk about it, but I was thinking, you're talking about this whole mess in terms of, fish meal within the increasing context of blue economy and blue growth, and uh, is it going to create much more mess in the discussions and the situations, or is it going to help us find some ways? Probably we know the answer, but what would be your take in terms of contextualizing this entire fish meal debate within the really fast growing blue economy, blue growth, context, what are the threats, and I don't know if you can take a minute to, or half a minute to quickly respond, and then we'll leave it to, future discussions, because I have to really bring it to an end. We're at time.
Right. I think this is a very important question. And what I can say with that is, of course, the emergence of the blue economy and the way some key players that should be championing fish for food are also, they are caught up in this idea of blue growth and blue economy, and that makes it so scary. For example, I'll give an example that the FAO, that is supposed to be a proper and food-driven organization for global food, has also immersed itself in these aquaculture production scenarios as a way of blue economy and blue growth. That makes it so scary because the food FAO is one of the organizations that should be championing this. But of course, they are caught in this blue economy and blue growth thing, and everywhere, big finances, big global banks, and governments are all embracing this idea of blue economy. I have always made the point in my publications that we need to contextualize the blue economy and what blue growth means. Blue growth in Senegal and in West Africa could be increasing food for fish for food consumption. That is the blue growth in that context. But if we move from that, our basic contextualization of the blue growth and what it means for us, and begin to embrace global scenarios of blue growth in other jurisdictions, one would fail. Of course, if the EU is classifying aquaculture as a major component or sector in the blue economy, yes, they are right to say so because they have that is what meet their context. But in cases where in West Africa, as I have shown, it is important that we also contextualize what blue growth means. And for me, in the case of West Africa, blue growth is small scale fisheries growth for food needs.
Okay, great. That's a great point to conclude here. But there is a lot of thoughts and there's a lot of questions and topics that can be discussed further into the future. This is a hot topic. As you can see from the passion with which we spoke about spoke in your talk. So thank you once again very much, Raymond. That was wonderful, and thanks for the time and thanks for really contributing to the debate on small scale fisheries, vulnerability to viability, transitions, and thanks to the audience for staying engaged and asking the many interesting questions. And I invite you to the July 29th talk. Please, we'll be circulating more information on that very soon. So looking forward to seeing you in our next edition of the V2V thematic webinar series in July at the end of. So thank you once again, everyone. Bye-bye.